Good evening and welcome to NTD UK News. I'm Stuart Lees. Here are today's top stories. Boris Johnson sets out plans to raise national insurance tax to overhaul adult social care.
Yes, I accept that this breaks a manifesto commitment, which is not something I do lightly, but a global pandemic was in no one's manifesto, Mr. Speaker.
The Home Secretary warns France it won't see the promised funds unless more migrants get intercepted before reaching England. And the Business Secretary orders a planned takeover review on grounds relating to national security of a graphene company in Wales. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has abandoned his pledge not to raise the main rates of tax. Today he sets out plans to overhaul adult social care and deal with the pandemic-fueled backlog in the NHS. NTD's Noel Woodrow has more on this.
The Prime Minister sets out plans to raise taxes to try to fix a health and social care funding crisis. It'll see the rate of national insurance payroll taxes paid by both workers and employers rise by 1.25%. The move breaks an election promise.
No Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, ever wants to raise taxes, and I will be honest with the House, I accept that this breaks a manifesto commitment, which is not something I do lightly, but a global pandemic was in no one's manifesto, Mr. Speaker.
Johnson says the increases would raise £36 billion over 3 years. The Conservative Party typically tried to keep taxes lower.
But having spent £407 billion or more to support lives and livelihoods throughout the pandemic, from furlough to vaccines, it would be wrong for me to say that we can pay for this recovery without taking the difficult but responsible decisions about how we finance it.
Johnson's also setting out to tackle the backlog in NHS waiting times.
So today we are beginning the biggest catch-up programme in NHS history, tackling the COVID backlogs by increasing hospital capacity to 110% and enabling 9 million more appointments, scans and operations.
Politicians have tried for years to find a way to pay for social care. Successive Conservative and Labour Prime Ministers have ducked the issue because they feared it would anger voters and their own parties. Neil Woodrow, NTD News.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the UK will not leave its allies in Afghanistan behind. The government is working through diplomatic channels to secure safe passage for them. NTD's John Robson brings us the details.
Keep this under review.
The Prime Minister tells Parliament the government is doing everything possible to secure safe passage to Afghans who can resettle in Britain. He says 300 Afghans who assisted the UK are still in the country.
So let me say to anyone to whom we've made commitments and who is currently in Afghanistan, we are working urgently with our friends in the region to secure safe passage, and as soon as routes are available, we will do everything possible to help you to reach safety.
The PM says the UK is launching a resettlement programme for 20,000 Afghans over the coming years, with 5,000 in the first year. And humanitarian assistance to the region has been doubled to nearly £300 million this year.
All who come to our country through this safe and legal route will receive not a 5-year visa, but indefinite leave to remain. Yeah. And our support will include free English courses for adults and 300 university scholarships.
Johnson says the government's first duty is to the security of the UK. As the host of G7, the UK aims to rally international consensus.
If the new regime in Kabul wants international recognition and access to the billions of dollars currently frozen in overseas accounts, then we and our friends will hold them to their agreement to prevent Afghanistan from ever again becoming an incubator for terrorism, and we shall insist on safe passage for anyone who wishes to leave and respect for the rights of women and girls.
Labour leader Keir Starmer criticises the government for lack of preparation, despite intelligence warnings of rapid Taliban advances.
We have a Prime Minister incapable of international leadership just when we needed it most.
Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab briefs the Commons on evacuation efforts.
Between the 15th and the 29th of August, the UK evacuated over 15,000 people from Afghanistan. And that includes over 8,000 British nationals, close to 5,000 Afghans who loyally served the UK, along with their dependents, and around 500 special cases of particularly vulnerable Afghans, including achieving scholars, journalists, human rights defenders, campaigners for women's rights, judges and many others.
He says about 500 British nationals left Afghanistan after the Foreign Office issued advice in April. And nearly 2,000 were airlifted out through a government scheme before the evacuations began.
In total since April, we've helped over 17,000 people leave.
Raab said he visited Qatar and Pakistan to re-establish flights to Kabul airport. He says the UK is working through diplomatic channels to secure safe passage out of the country. Joanne Robson, NTD News.
Better weather conditions encourage migrants to cross the English Channel in large numbers. This comes as the Home Secretary reportedly said she's prepared to withhold funds promised to the French unless more boats get intercepted. NTD's El Rhodes has this report.
According to The Times, citing government sources, almost 1,000 crossed the English Channel, potentially a new daily record. Official figures have yet to be released. Aerial footage shows a dinghy being towed by a UK Border Force vessel off the coast of Kent. Better weather conditions are thought to have encouraged people to attempt the journey following a fortnight of poor weather. Home Secretary Priti Patel is expected to discuss the matter with her French counterpart in London this week. Earlier this year, they announced an agreement to more than double the number of police patrolling French beaches to stop small boats from leaving France. As part of the deal, the government pledged to give France £54 million. The Times says Patel told MPs, "We've not given them a penny of the money so far, and France is going to have to get its act together if it wants to see the cash." At least 12,500 people have now made the crossing to the UK in 2021. Earl Rhodes, NTD News.
Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng has ordered a review of a proposed takeover of a graphene company in Wales due to national security concerns. The Perpetuous Group supplies at least 1/4 of all graphene plasma in the UK. Graphene is a relatively new material with 200 times the strength of steel. It's light, potentially superconductive, and can be used in layers just 1 atom deep. Its applications are still being developed across sectors such as health, aerospace, and electronics. The takeover involves Taurus International and a Chinese scientist with industry links in China who already works with Perpetuous. Such interventions are rare, especially for smaller companies like Perpetuous. A look now at surveillance cameras linked to human rights abuses in China that are used throughout the UK, including in the government's Department of Health. A Freedom of Information request reveals 45 high-vision cameras are currently in use in the building. NTD's Jen Worrell brings us this report.
The UK's Department of Health has fitted cameras from a company involved with major surveillance projects in the Xinjiang region's alleged re-education camps. A Freedom of Information request by NTD reveals the Department of Health building in London is currently using 45 cameras made by Hikvision, a firm blacklisted by the US as a potential threat to national security. The department said no Chinese companies have installed or run CCTV cameras in the building, and the camera that captured former Health Secretary Matt Hancock's affair was a different brand called Accuses. However, it's previously been reported that Hikvision cameras are used in UK leisure centres, schools and council buildings. The UK's Foreign Affairs Committee this July published a report titled Never Again, the UK's responsibility to act on atrocities in Xinjiang and beyond. In it, the committee recommends the government forbid surveillance companies like Hikvision from operating in the UK. Former Security Minister and former head of the Royal Navy, Lord West of Spithead, says the use of these cameras is concerning.
So these cameras, they've been providing surveillance to detention camps in China, and they've got strong ties to the Chinese Communist Party and its military. But they're being used in the Department of Health building in the UK. So what's your reaction to that?
Well, I think we need to be very, very careful about this because, as you rightly say, these Chinese companies have a certain amount of control by the Chinese government. Although the Chinese say that's not the case, we know it's written into their law and they have a certain amount of capability of looking at what they're producing and what they're doing. And there's no doubt at all that as we move towards the next stage of telecommunications, the tier 5 ones, that all of the Internet of Things becomes more of a reality. Everything becomes interconnected. And I know from my own experience of our intelligence, one can use CCTV because you can get into the system and you can then draw down information. And putting, for example, these cameras in the Department of Health, I don't know exactly where they are, but you can use cameras to record audio as well as video. They can see telephone numbers. They can see what passwords you're putting in. They can get personal data on all sorts of people. They can get the medical records of people, which can be very useful sometimes. And it really worries me that there doesn't seem to be any thought about what the risk is, because I mean, clearly, if you just put one camera looking by the front door to see if anyone's coming in, that's slightly different from having them all over the building. So I don't think there's been enough effort into that. The other thing you mentioned, quite rightly, there is no doubt that these cameras and this firm is being used in the oppression of the Uyghurs. And there is an issue there in terms of, are we happy in human rights terms to be involved with companies that are involved in that sort of thing? So there are two sort of issues there.
In terms of Huawei, the UK government seems, they've taken a harder stance on Huawei, but there doesn't seem to be a similar policy towards companies like Hikvision. Why do you think that might be?
I think it's just losing sight of the ball. I think people haven't focused on all of these things. All of these things matter. And Huawei became a cause célèbre for a number of reasons, not least because the Americans and others were very anti it. I mean, I have no doubt that our initial view of Huawei was we could handle and control the risks. As soon as the Americans said they weren't going to provide chips for them, there's no doubt whatsoever that we couldn't possibly keep using it because we had no ability to ensure its security and safety. So it's quite right that we changed our stance then. But no one seems to look. It's not just CCTV. There are other things where Chinese companies are involved, often through shadow companies. You have to step back 3 or 4 layers to find out what it is. And finding them taking over companies that produce, I don't know, chips and other bits and pieces, I think we need to be extremely careful and we need to look at this very, very carefully indeed.
Hikvision has previously stated it is committed to human rights and they don't have access to devices without users' authorization. The Department of Health didn't respond in time for deadline. Jane Worrell, NTD News, London.
The UK's national data watchdog is approaching privacy regulators in G7 nations to help tackle cookie pop-ups online. For many, cookie pop-ups are frowned upon, seen as a nuisance, and also raise concerns about online privacy. Information Commissioner Elizabeth Denham says it's an issue that no single country can tackle alone. The Information Commissioner's office is proposing to introduce lasting privacy settings to websites as opposed to people having to set these preferences each time they go online. It says the approach is already technologically possible and compliant with data protection law. Denham was set to address privacy regulators of Canada, France, Italy, Japan, the United States and Germany in a virtual meeting on Tuesday. Next, the restoration of Britain's iconic Big Ben Tower at the Houses of Parliament has moved closer to completion. The hands on its famous clock have now been restored to their original Prussian blue colour. We have more on this from NTD's Eddie Aiken.
The 177-year-old Big Ben Tower has been swathed in scaffolding since 2017 when craftsmen began work on refurbishment. The work consisted of revamping its stonework, reglazing the 4 clock dials and repainting the ironwork. The tower was renamed Elizabeth Tower in 2012 to mark the Diamond Jubilee anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II. The £80 million restoration project is due to be completed next year, and the famous 13-ton Big Ben bell will chime again. During work on the 315-foot tower, restorers discovered that the clock hands were originally painted blue rather than black. The hands are now restored to their original colour. Eddie Aiken, NTD News.
Still to come, survivors of the 2015 terror attack in Paris recall the event that claimed 130 lives as a trial of 20 suspects opens. That and more after the break. Survivors of the ISIS terrorist attack on Paris in 2015 and those who mourn the 130 dead are bracing for the long-awaited trial and hoping for justice. NTD's El Rhodes has the story.
History teacher Christophe Nandon's life was shattered 6 years ago. What should have been a pleasant evening at a concert became the most deadly attack in peacetime France. Some 130 people were killed and hundreds wounded in the gun and bomb assault in Paris on the 13th of November 2015. ISIS terrorists attacked the Bataclan concert hall, 6 bars and restaurants, and the perimeter of a sports stadium. The trial of suspects opens on Wednesday in Paris. Nandon hopes it will help people better understand what happened that night.
What happened to the suspects, whether it's Salah Abdeslam or others, it did not interest me at all. And it still doesn't interest me. What matters to me is what the victims, civil parties, their parents and loved ones will say.
Nandon managed to lock himself in a storage room with 20 other concert-goers during the attack. He emerged physically unharmed from his ordeal, but has since suffered from post-traumatic stress and anxiety. Jean-Pierre Albertini's 39-year-old son died at the Bataclan. He recalls what his family and other victims have gone through.
The day it affects you, it is so violent, so sudden. It targets people, you see. If it were me, it would have happened towards the end of my lifetime. And in the book that I wrote the names of all the people who died. They're all between 20 and 40-year-olds. It's a generation that was massacred.
He doesn't expect the proceedings to provide any relief. Another survivor said he felt most anger towards those who masterminded the attacks.
It's really more those who manipulated the assailants that we feel resentment for. To us, the assailants were more like puppets, and they were used. The issue is the puppeteers today aren't really sitting in the dock.
The November 2015 attacks left deep scars on the national psyche. In all, 20 men face trial. 14 will be in court, and 6 will be tried in absentia. All but one of the absent men are presumed dead in Syria or Iraq. Earl Rhodes, NTD News.
One of the leaders of mass street protests against Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko last year was sentenced to 11 years in prison on Monday. Lauren Anthony reports.
Maria Kolesnikova, who led mass street protests against Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko last year, was sentenced to 11 years in jail on Monday. The 39-year-old was detained after ripping up her passport, an attempt to stop Belarusian security forces from deporting her in a standoff at the Ukrainian border in September. She and another senior opposition figure, Maxim Znak, were charged with extremism and trying to seize power illegally. They both deny wrongdoing, with Kolesnikova calling the charges absurd. The musician-turned-politician became one of the faces of a large opposition movement during the country's presidential election in August 2020. Protesters claim the vote was rigged in an effort to prolong Lukashenko's grip on power. Lukashenko, who vehemently denies electoral fraud, has been in office since 1994. The trial, which began last month, was closed to the public on national security grounds. The European Union denounced the verdict, while Britain's Foreign Minister called it an assault on defenders of democracy. The circumstances of the case, the investigators and the witnesses have not been disclosed.
The German government accuses Russia of being responsible for a new wave of cyber attacks on MPs. The Foreign Ministry on Monday called for an end to what it calls unacceptable action. The ministry said the Russian military intelligence service, GRU, is behind phishing attacks that attempt to obtain personal logging data, especially of members of parliament. The identity theft could then be used to prepare disinformation in connection with the upcoming elections. Russia calls the accusations a conspiracy by Germany. In Amsterdam, relatives of the 298 victims from downed Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 are being given the opportunity to speak or submit statements in the murder trial of 4 suspects. Louisa Nax reports.
Families of the victims of the downed Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 called for justice on Monday as they began testifying in the Dutch murder trial of 4 suspects. Australian Vanessa Risk lost her parents in the crash.
They were gone just like that. Not even 1 hour later, the media was on the phone asking me to confirm if Albert and Marie Elizabeth Risk were on flight MH17. That was the moment I realised our loss was the knowledge of the world. I remember thinking to myself, how do I even answer that? How would the perpetrators answer that if it was their loved ones? How would they feel if their life was caught up in a political nightmare that their country wasn't even involved in? How would Putin and his corrupt Russian government answer that?
Risk is one of dozens of relatives who will be given an opportunity to speak or submit written statements over the coming 3 weeks.
It is now time for a conviction. I plead to the court that the victims and their families now receive justice. To the perpetrators, 7 years ago, you broke up my family in the worst way imaginable. 7 years on, I am determined that you will never ever break my spirit and capacity to live and love just as my dear parents would have wanted me to.
MH17 was flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur in 2014 when it was hit by what international investigators and prosecutors say was a Russian surface-to-air missile that originated from a Russian base just across the Ukrainian border. All 298 people on board the passenger aircraft were killed. Moscow denies all responsibility and has refused to extradite the suspects, 3 Russians and a Ukrainian citizen who are all suspected of having key roles in the separatist forces. Judges said on Monday they expected to issue a judgment in late 2022.
And finally, in southern France, dozens of pickers are harvesting jasmine flowers. It's a key ingredient in the legendary Chanel No. 5 perfume, which celebrates its 100th anniversary. The story comes from NTD's Joanne Robson.
Wearing wide-brimmed hats to shield from the Mediterranean sun, dozens of pickers collect handfuls of jasmine flowers. Collected in the southern French city of Grasse, these fragrant flowers are the key ingredient in one of the world's most famous perfumes, Chanel No. 5. In the 1980s, Chanel struck a deal with the local Moule family, who owns the fields.
The jasmine of Grasse is probably the most important ingredient of Chanel's perfume No. 5. It is an ingredient that we've had to work hard for.
This year marks the perfume's 100th anniversary. According to the Moule family, production has not been overly affected by COVID-19. The virus can cause people to lose their sense of smell, a particular problem for perfumers known as noses in the business.
For sure, it was a pretty peculiar year, but in many ways it was the same for me as for everyone. Even though I'm a nose, we all tried not to get COVID-19.
Though the first modern perfumes were created in the late 19th century, fragrance making has existed in grass since the Middle Ages. The craft has been passed down and perfected. In 1921, fashion designer Coco Chanel created the Her brand signature fragrance, composed of over a dozen scents. It was favoured by Hollywood stars such as Marilyn Monroe and Audrey Hepburn, propelling Chanel No. 5 into the spotlight. Joanne Robson, NTD News.
That's the news for today, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Stuart Lees. Thank you for watching our daily news show on YouTube. You can also watch our other programming on channel 190 on Sky TV or on Freeview via channel box on channel 271. In the meantime though, please give this video a like and hit subscribe to our channel. Have a good day.